You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, a twice-convicted arsonist is one of the first in Ontario to challenge the constitutionality of Canada's new DNA identification legislation. Daniel Dwyer is fighting a court order to provide a blood sample for DNA analysis. Prosecutors want Dyer's genetic profile stored in a national database. His defense lawyer, however, is arguing that the seizure of Dwyer's blood against his will would violate fundamental principles of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, especially the right to privacy and security of persons set out in Section 7. Well, today on the show, we'll hear views from both sides of the argument, those who are in favor of Canada's DNA legislation and those who are against it. And as always, the phones will be open to take your calls, so don't go away. We're back right after this. Canada's new DNA databank. Police say it's an important tool in the fight against crime, while critics say it violates personal freedoms. Scott Newark is among those who campaigned long and hard to see the creation of this new databank. He's a former Crown attorney and is a nationally renowned advocate for justice reform and victims' rights. Right now, he's special counsel to the Office for Victims of Crime. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
So how do you feel? We have seen it was a long and hard campaign to finally see the creation of a DNA databank in this country. How do you feel about its final incarnation?
Well, it's better than no DNA databank, but that's probably about as much as I would say. The government, the Liberal government, failed to listen to the advice of law enforcement to, in effect, replicate the process and the legal framework that we use for taking fingerprints. Because of the additional uses the DNA can be put to, my guess is that they decided to put all sorts of discretionary barriers in place related to taking the samples, to allow for courts not to order samples to be taken. The biggest problem with it, actually, Rhonda, is they don't duplicate the procedure we use on fingerprints now, which is when you take the DNA sample. Instead of it, as it is in fingerprinting, when you take it at the time a person is charged, i.e. when we have the person in custody, it requires waiting until the person is actually convicted. And given the fact that its potential is to reveal information about unsolved crimes, a lot of people who know that if they're going to get convicted don't show up to give their DNA. It's better than nothing, but we still have a long way to go to use it to its full potential and maximize public safety.
What are the restrictions placed on collecting DNA right now?
Well, the biggest one really is the timing of the taking of the sample, and many people, not only all law enforcement, but also the Ontario government, the Alberta government, have pointed out to the federal government that they've made a fundamental mistake. When somebody's arrested right now, the law authorizes us to take, in effect, unique finger impressions via fingerprints from that person at the time that they're actually arrested. We can then use that information for investigation purposes on that crime or also any other unsolved crime. So we actually have this sort of a database of fingerprint trace evidence that we can match it up to. That's what we should do on DNA. Instead of that, the government introduced the legislation that said you can't take it then. You have to wait until the person is actually convicted. The flaw with that, obviously, is that if somebody knows that let's say they're charged with a break and enter. Traditionally, people who do break and enters also are involved in sexual offenses as well. And we have the person charged with a break and enter. Well, we don't know he's also responsible, say, for 6 or 7 serial rapes. What do you think the odds are of him coming back to get convicted on the break and enter when he knows that we'll get his, or potentially get his DNA then, in which case we'll identify him as a serial rapist? That's compounded in this country because it's so big that when, say, somebody, use the example of the break and enter that I described, and he doesn't come back, 6 months later, we may pick him up in British Columbia, and they will literally call up and they'll see, well, yes, there's a warrant for him, say, in Ontario. And they'll phone and say, do you want the guy back? The odds are quite good that we'll say, nah, it's too far away. Never mind, you keep him.
But don't you have to be especially careful when you're dealing with DNA because it is the building block for human life, for all life, whereas fingerprints have essentially no other purpose?
Yeah, that's true, and that's why the legislation, when we suggested it, should be crafted in such a way that can only be used for specific purposes. Look, it's absolutely true that the DNA can be used for other purposes, as you mentioned, other than just criminal forensic purposes. So number one, let's define what can it be used for. Number two, let's actually make it a crime, which is what we suggested. That part the government did get right, and they included it, so it can't be used for anything else. But number three, if people are really concerned genuinely about the potential privacy violations, I have news for them. Credit card companies are keeping far more extensive files in relation to personal information. And in fact, as we learned just a couple of months ago, so is the government of Canada in the HRDC files that they were keeping on people. We have the capacity to regulate that, to specifically say that you can't do it. It doesn't make sense, in our opinion, that you would simply throw away this incredibly valuable investigative tool and all the public safety benefits that go with it.
But it is frightening, and I don't want to sound too Orwellian here today, but it's frightening that the government could come into contact with human DNA, which can create a whole new person. The technology is just, you know, within our lifetime, certainly, Scott, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it within a few years.
Although that's not confined to government, is it?
No.
I mean, if you think about it, I just deposited DNA on that glass. Okay, if somebody really was so inclined, after I leave the studio here, somebody could do something with that. So in that sense,
because that's a valuable DNA. Yeah. That's yours.
Well, there's a joke about that. When we went to testify before the Justice Committee, I actually brought an IDEN officer and showed them all the different ways that it was taken, because the issue for them was about how intrusive it was. And the joke was about that, as we were taking hair samples and fingerprints, that somebody could clone me, sort of thing, which I think, you know, bothered some Liberal MPs. But so let's, you know, we need to not sort of underestimate the importance of what DNA is, but by the same token, I don't think we should be fearing technology once we do what we can do as a society, which is regulate it by law, make sure there's stiff penalties, and make sure that it's a very tightly controlled process. But we shouldn't. The line we used to use when I was with the police is that the police really didn't need any new powers. What they wanted to be able to use, though, was the technology of the 20th century instead of the 18th century.
So just how effective do you think this tool will be in the fight against crime?
One of the fundamental things...
Also in the fight against wrongful convictions.
Absolutely. One of the fundamental things about our justice system, and really everybody's, is that there's a disproportionately small number of offenders responsible for a disproportionately large number of offenses. When you target that group, you get very good public safety benefits. There's, where I first got involved in this, actually, I was given a speech in Vancouver, and I was ranting and, you know, about all the things that we need to change in the law and stuff. It was back in '93, so there was more. And at the end of the speech, these two shady-looking guys came up to me. They turned out to be RCMP homicide investigators. And I'd been talking about the need for DNA evidence. At that point, we didn't even have DNA search warrants. And they gave me this study that they had done on unsolved homicides and serial rapes just in British Columbia. I mean, the numbers were staggering about the number of these unsolved, most serious crimes. There are hundreds of unsolved murders, thousands of unsolved serial sexual assaults in this country. DNA, what it actually does is it is going to provide the most important tool to be able to solve those unsolved crimes. And it's not just because, you know, we don't like having mysteries on our hands. It's because the people who commit those crimes tend to commit them over and over and over again. If we had a proper DNA database, I assure you, it's one of the things that offends me the most about the government, the federal government, not doing this. If we had a proper DNA database, I assure you there will be people that will not be assaulted and not be killed. The converse, unfortunately, is true. Because we don't have one, there will be people, particularly women and children, who will be raped and killed because we don't have it. One day we will get it. I have no doubt one day we will finally get it. But until then, people are going to needlessly be victimized.
Why do you say we don't have a proper DNA data bank?
Well, number one, we don't take the samples when we should. Okay, and as a result, we have this gaping hole. And I already explained that's aggravated by the distance of the country. We don't return on warrants. Number two, as you mentioned in your introduction, being Canadian, of course, we tended not to simply say, once you're charged with this offense, we're going to take your sample. If you're not convicted, we'll destroy the sample. Instead, we gave the courts discretion at the front end to say, well, yeah, it's true you were just convicted of this offense, but maybe we're not going to take it. And there's a whole other series of offenses which the court has an even further discretion. That should not be the case. It's simply that if you're charged with the offense, like we do with fingerprints, we should take, and by the way, it's no more intrusive than a Q-tip swab on the inside of your mouth that takes epithelial cells. That's all it is. This is the great weapon. Okay? The third thing that is the biggest problem with it is, unlike fingerprints, where we can go to anybody who's in custody and take the samples, that means inside federal prisons and provincial jails, we're not allowed to do that. The only people that we can get it from are people who've been convicted of sexual offenses twice. Once is not enough. And people, and I'm not making this up, people who've been convicted of more than one murder, and it has to have not been committed at the same time.
Wow.
That is how arcane and ridiculous the federal government's restrictions are on the DNA databanks.
I'm amazed that there's going to be any samples in the DNA databank at all.
There are some, and it's growing, and people convicted of the most serious offenses, courts are ordering the samples be taken, and it's going to continue to evolve. But this government imposed, in my opinion, a number of completely unnecessary restrictions. They didn't do proper legal analysis of what the obstacles were or weren't, and gave us what is not a particularly as effective tool as it could be. Don't get me wrong. It is much better than no DNA data bank at all. But people, because of these failures, people are needlessly going to be victimized until we fix it.
I want to talk to you more about that, but first we have to take a commercial break. Also, our phone lines are open. I want to hear your views on this today. The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Phone lines are open. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're joined in studio by lawyer Scott Newark. Before we went to commercial break, you were talking about the DNA data bank and the problems with the legislation as it exists right now. You basically say what we have now is better than no DNA data bank at all, but not much.
Well, I want to be as fair as I can. We worked long and hard on this with a lot of other people, and we're getting there. Like, you know, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, we didn't have DNA search warrants as well, too. And when Alan Rock was Justice Minister, we were able to move that through much more quickly. I actually, it's rare in my experience that individual ministers have some fairly direct responsibility. This is one I think that I guess she's former Justice Minister McClellan bears some responsibility on, because the arguments against it were pretty specious, frankly. I have a fairly biased view, I suppose, because I was the one pushing it. But, you know, it's better than what it should be. We have a model in place. I guess that's what most of us find the most frustrating in the Identification of Criminals Act with fingerprint. We have the model in place. And why we didn't simply use what's already there, not grant new powers, but use new technology, is something that I think that Ms. McClellan probably has to answer for.
Just how stringent are the restrictions on the collection of this DNA evidence? Well,
this is Canada, so everything is regulated. We have all sorts of laws up and down and stuff, and there's only 3 approved methods. One is by plucking hair, one is from a sterile lancet and taking blood, and one is, as I mentioned, is from taking a little Q-tip swab and sticking it in the inside of your cheek and pulling it out. Those are the 3 approved methods by which DNA can be gathered. There's, as you can imagine, a whole sort of process you go through for testing and introduction of the evidence and everything else. So it's a very tightly regulated process. It's also very tightly regulated as to what can happen with those samples, and including if somebody is found not guilty or the charge is withdrawn, that the samples must be destroyed. Those protections are all proper. We just suggest that what we should do is get the benefits from the samples as well, too, in the most effective way.
What do you say to the argument being put forth by Daniel Dwyer's lawyer that this is a violation, forcing him, in this case, prosecutors want him to deliver a blood sample, which is just a little pinprick and a little bit of blood, but he says that's a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Well, number one,
particularly Section 7, if you want to get really...
Right. Number one, as a matter of law, he's wrong. But quite apart from that, as a matter of law, we didn't select Mr. Dwyer based on his shoe size. Mr. Dwyer committed a series of criminal offenses.
And he's a twice convicted arsonist.
Right. And so he sort of got there by a process that entitles us now to be able to recognize that we're entitled to this information, including to be used for investigation on that offense, other unsolved offenses, or future offenses. There's one simple way not to do this: don't commit crimes. But when you do commit a crime, frankly, the rest of us are entitled to the protection of the technology that's available to us.
Okay. Well, we've got, our phones are ringing, so let's go to Danny Dwyer, actually, online too. Go ahead, Danny, you're on the air. Hi, go ahead, Danny, you're on the air. Oh, we're having a bit of technical problems. Let's go to Roman on line 1. Go ahead, Roman, you're on the air.
Hello, yeah. I think if a person has committed a crime and they're convicted, then the DNA should go in the data bank. It's not a matter of having them any privacy anymore. I agree with the lawyer. Is if when these people commit a crime and repeatedly commits murder or serious offenses, they don't have to go through procedures and policy to commit these crimes. And if you have a loved one who has been killed by a repeat offender, that loved one is dead and gone. You see that person no more. But that other person is left there to fight through regulations, and he keeps going and doing it over and over. So society has to take responsibility to put a stop to these things.
Okay, Roman, thank you so much for your phone call. What about the argument that it really, because DNA is the basic building block of life, and it is, as you pointed out, the test or the method of collecting DNA is not necessarily intrusive, but because of its potential for misuse, do we need to be more careful with the collection of DNA than the collection of, let's say, fingerprints?
Sure. Sure. I mean, although, you know, ironically, because it is so easily collectible, forensically, the developments in how we get it are advancing as well, too. In Australia, for example, the process by which DNA is gathered is being reduced to putting, you know, a person's hands onto a glass plate. You leave skin cells when you put your hand, which is exactly what you do with fingerprinting, which the Supreme Court has already said is okay, including taking it at time of arrest. We're going to be able to get it that way as well, too. I think the larger issue is, given the fact that there is this other potential unauthorized use that can come from DNA, are we going to use it and regulate it, or are we going to just essentially put our hands up to our eyes and say no, and we're prepared to accept literally the casualties that will come from that because we won't use science to the best ability to track down people responsible for unsolved crimes? That's a question I guess individuals philosophically have to make. I know what my answer to that question is.
Well, if you have to provide fingerprints when you're just arrested, you're not convicted of any crime, and that's pretty intrusive. As we were talking before the show, that police even have the authority to break your hands if you're not cooperating.
Yeah, I'm exaggerating a bit. They have, although under the Identification of Criminals Act, police are empowered to use force to take the samples. And even at that, that's not done arbitrarily. We don't authorize cops to go down the street and just grab somebody and say, I'm going to take your fingerprints. You have to be, there has to be reasonable and probable grounds for a police officer to lay the information. It's got to be an indictable offense. There's a process all set out in the criminal code, so it of itself is not arbitrary either. There's safeguards built into the procedures of the law. The issue I think people need to address is, are we going to use the science of the 20th and 21st century in terms of public safety, keeping in mind the necessary protections given what the DNA evidence can provide?
Okay. Let's go to Danny on line 2. Go ahead, Danny. You're on the air.
Hi, how you doing?
Hi, Danny. I'm fine.
I'm kind of incarcerated, and I believe your guest, he has some valid points. But what they don't tell you with the law is that they can test anybody with a scheduled crime. Or, in such as my case, they can take the judge's decision and take me into a room and hold me down forcefully, 10 or more officers, and in a situation as a victim who's being raped, that is violating her rights. If I'm holding her down and she's saying no, no is no, no matter which way you say it. And this is something the government doesn't understand.
Danny, 2 points, if I might. Number 1, the police are authorized by law right now to take your fingerprints and using force. And number 2, I guess there's one difference between you and the rape victim, isn't there?
Yeah,
she didn't commit an offense. You did, more than once. That's what entitles us to take your DNA.
But the government is using that legislation to commit a crime against me under Section 7.
That's your opinion, sir. Frankly, don't light places on fire, and we won't be taking DNA samples from you.
Hey, I don't admit that the crimes that I committed weren't senseless and moronic crimes, but they weren't rapes, murders, or anything, and there was no DNA involved in my crime.
Well, you'll understand if we aren't necessarily as convinced as you are that you aren't going to do it in the future, or secondarily that you haven't committed other crimes that the evidence that we're seeking to get right now may help in solving.
Yeah, it's retroactive, and that's giving evidence against myself.
So is fingerprinting, sir. The Supreme Court of Canada has upheld it, and it's a legitimate. Again, I mean, just make the point. You know, we're not doing it on a random basis. We're doing it. There's got to be a predicate act that you and only you are the one who can control. That is committing crimes.
If that's what you're saying, you guys are basing your law on the British law, which in Britain they can sweep 5,000 people in the area and DNA them, which is moronic.
Yeah, well, we're not doing that.
But you're trying to finger prick me. You're not asking for a swab. You're violating my body. You're not asking for a swab. You are asking for blood from my finger.
You know what? My daughter is 8 years old, and she's a diabetic, okay? And she tests her fingers for blood about 6 times a day, okay? And as a result, I remember when we first learned about it, and we all had this so we could experience it as well, too. Give me a break. Okay? I know it's involved in taking a little pinprick of blood from you, sir. And again, I'll go back to the point. If you want to avoid this, don't commit crimes. You made the choice not to do that. Now, frankly, we just think that we should be entitled to use technology and science to get the best information from you.
Okay, Danny, I want to thank you so much for your phone call, for phoning in. Scott, Newark, our time is gone. I want to thank
Always
you
a pleasure.
so much for joining us. The pleasure, sir, is all mine. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to continue this conversation. Here's some different views on Canada's DNA data bank and how far it should go. Our phone lines are open. I want to hear your thoughts and opinions, and we're back with more right after these messages. Oh, super. Today we're talking about the creation of a DNA data bank in Canada, how far it should go, what limitations it should face. Joining our conversation, lawyer Paul McKeever. He's an executive member of the Freedom Party of Ontario. And Paul, you have some concerns over Canada's new DNA data bank. Scott Newark says it doesn't go nearly far enough.
Well, one of the things Scott said, I appreciate what he has to face in terms of the police trying to track down, people who have committed crimes, and that's, I think, a legitimate use for DNA. I don't think the question is, should we be using DNA to fight crime? And in fact, to some degree, I think I'd have to agree with him that the police should be able to go right ahead and take their sample at the time of laying the charge. Otherwise, it might be a bit late. But apart from that issue, my concern is with the data bank itself and with government's tendencies to use information like that to create new efficiencies or just to gain power. If you have the ability, for example, as they do now, to collect these pieces of data, you may find that there are new ideas suggested. I know that the Privacy Commissioner, for example, has said the following. I'll just read this to you because I think it's on point. The greatest danger of a forensic DNA databank is its potential to engulf a significant part of the population and become a genetic population register, recovering abducted children, assisting adults with amnesia, providing security for Alzheimer patients. All could be offered as justification for extending genetic sampling and would blur the line between forensic, that is criminal, and non-forensic or non-criminal uses.
But Paul, can you not legislate that? And clearly, there are very strict regulations in terms of the DNA data bank and how it's being used right now. Some would say it's far too strict. Mm-hmm. Well, for instance, as Scott Newark pointed out, even if you're a mass murderer, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be added to the DNA data bank.
The ease with which laws are changed, though, is my concern. If we were talking about a constitutional law, I wouldn't be as concerned. But the laws that brought in the DNA data bank can be changed overnight with a few votes in the House of Commons.
But shouldn't we fight that when the time comes?
Perhaps, but there's just too much for us to fight.
But in the meantime, though, there's this incredible, powerful investigative tool that has not just the potential to solve unsolved crimes, but also the ability to exonerate the wrongfully accused.
Well, let's talk about criminal uses. And right now, we're saying that DNA is a good use. The good use for DNA is to solve existing crimes. What about the situation where science concludes that there is a gene that makes it that is an indicator that a person is more likely than the average person to commit, for example, a rape. Right now, we have a person, I think in Toronto, who is suing the police for not telling her in advance that there was a rapist living in her area. We have a convicted pedophile who now is running around the province trying to avoid people who have honest and legitimate concerns that he'll be living in their area. So when we have concerns about people, and what they're likely to do, not what they've necessarily even done, but what they're likely to do because they have this gene, then we're going to see lawsuits.
But that's a fatuous argument, though, because that's not how the DNA data bank is being used right now.
Not right now.
nobody's talking about testing the general population. We're just talking about people who are charged. Well, what Scott Newark would like to say is when you're charged with a crime, when your fingerprints are taken, your DNA is taken too, and if you're exonerated,
right,
then they'll destroy the...
That doesn't disturb me in the least. I think that's an appropriate use of DNA evidence. My concern is that if you look at the big picture, there are on the horizon all sorts of different databases that are being set up federally, provincially. For example, a health database, which will include not information only about your health, but about your lifestyle, your tendencies toward your lifestyle choices. And they're trying to build a database that will help the government understand you personally so that they can make your healthcare system more efficient. When efficiency is the only reason to use this very personal information, I think we have missed the boat. We first have to question whether it's appropriate to use that information for efficiency purposes. For example, the healthcare situation. If there's a gene there that says you're likely to develop breast cancer, and we're living in a situation where, unfortunately, in my view, we have a public system of healthcare and you're forced into it, you may be found, you might find yourself in a situation where you have to pay the government a large healthcare tax levy because you have gene 42. Or you may find yourself completely ineligible for certain, for example, courses in school because the government has determined that you don't have the gene that makes you smart enough or talented enough.
And the day that they want to extend, DNA collection to that degree when they start testing the general population, I'd be the first one doing, wall-to-wall shows screaming against it.
Right.
But what is wrong with collecting forensic evidence?
The problem is, I think...
Do you have a problem with police collecting fingerprints?
Oh, not at all. And I don't think I have a problem with them. And there's no problem with them using the DNA evidence, I think, even at the time of charging. That's not the issue. And it's not the police, in fact, that I'm concerned about. It's the tendencies of governments to react to public pressures and to sometimes see themselves as creating new efficiencies with the information that they have. And that really scares me.
Paul, our phones are absolutely ringing off the hook. Let's go to Tala on line 1. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Hello.
Hi, go ahead, you're on the air.
Okay, this is kind of making me a little uneasy because we're talking about criminals here.
Right.
We're talking about our children, we're talking about our wives, our sisters, our husbands, our brothers, and we have to do what it takes to get these people. I'm extremely interested in forensic science.
Right.
They're taking DNA when they're on the scene, as in like skin underneath someone's fingernail, out of a murder thing, anything. They have DNA. They've been using it for like years, thousands of years. And I really think that I really think with all the restrictions, I think they're protecting the criminals and not the innocent.
Okay, Tala, thank you so much for your phone call. And you really don't have a big objection to the
No.
forensic use. You're just, it's the slippery slope argument.
Right.
That if we start collecting Paul Bernardo's DNA, when are they going to start coming for Paul McKeever's?
Ultimately, yes. And I think you really have a two-edged sword where you give information to a government. There's no guarantee, there's no constitutional guarantee, certainly, that they will limit themselves to using that information only for its original purpose. And in fact, I think your first guest said, look, we already see that the government with the HRDC was abusing that information. Why then should we trust them with something so sacrosanct as our genetic information and say, they're never going to have me excluded from a high school or from a university because of my DNA. They're never going to make me pay more for health care. I mean, or they're never going to say that perhaps I have a tendency toward voting on a joining a certain political party. I mean, we do not know. We certainly, for example, it might sound absurd, but we have people saying that, for example, homosexuality is determined by genetics, a preference to have sex with a person of the same sex. Why then should any other preference be something that we wouldn't expect to be found in the genes? And should we not then fear a government that might say, we don't want the days of the world coming out and being politicians? Maybe they're just a little too dangerous.
We're going to create like a genetic blueprint for liberal voters.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
I'm intrigued. I want to talk to you more about that. But first we have to take a commercial break. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about Canada's DNA databank, how far such a forensic tool should go, or, as Paul McKeever suggested, you're from the Freedom Party, that this could be a slippery slope, that perhaps this kind of information, DNA, the basic building block of life, that somehow that it could be misused, and that's your concern. Paul, our phone's quite busy today, so let's go to Lynn on line 7. Go ahead, Lynn, you're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi. The previous speaker just said something about, well, you shouldn't do the crime.
Right.
You don't want to have DNA tested.
Right.
But if we look at our justice system, if we look at the people who are convicted, charged and convicted of crimes, they're mostly people from the lower socioeconomic background. And I think that DNA testing is just a step beyond fingerprinting welfare, people who are on welfare, and I believe that it's a system designed to keep lower socioeconomic individuals down. And I know that you also stated that DNA would be used for serious crimes, but the speaker right now, I can't remember his name.
Paul McKeever.
Paul, he mentioned that it would only be used for serious crimes, and also that it could be DNA would be taken at the time that someone is charged. But when someone is charged, they're innocent till proven guilty. But
yeah, Lynn, but I'm going to stop you there, though. Do you have any objection to fingerprints being taken at the time charges are laid?
Yes, I do, because you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. But your rights are violated and your fingerprints are taken. It's a symbolic representation to an individual that you don't mean anything. We're going to fingerprint you. We know you're innocent till proven guilty, but you're charged with this offense, and we're going to fingerprint you anyway. And it's a symbolic representation for the so-called criminal as well.
But it's also an important forensic tool. When you take those fingerprints, it's a way for police to go back to the crime scene, if it's a break-and-enter, if it's a murder, and see if in fact you were there.
But if you're going to be taking...
But those fingerprints are only taken when there is other evidence that indicates that you're guilty.
But we also know...
People are not just stopped on the street, Lynn, and forced to give up their fingerprints just because they're poor.
We also know... No, but we also know that most people who are... If you just sit in court, go to court one day and look at what you see, you don't see anybody from upper-class backgrounds in court, generally. And our laws are designed to keep the have-nots from having. And we know that. That's shown in history. So if we take the fingerprints, if we take the DNA, people will commit certain crimes. Whether they're serious or not, how are you going to define whether it's serious enough to take DNA or not? And then once the DNA isn't taken, how do we know it's not going to be used against that individual in the future?
Okay, Lynn, thank you. Well, it is going to be used against that individual in the future if they're convicted of a crime. If they're exonerated or if they're acquitted, the DNA evidence is destroyed. So, Lynn, I want to thank you so much for your phone call. What do you say to that argument that...
Well, I'm not convinced by it.
First off, Paul Bernardo was upper middle class. He certainly wasn't among like the lower echelons.
That's right.
Of the
I think you have
socioeconomic
to...
scale.
This to me sounds a little bit like putting the cart before the horse. We don't make crimes so that the less fortunate will have to remain less fortunate. We make laws about crime so that nobody is hurt and nobody's property is taken. And evidence is collected, fingerprints are collected, DNA evidence is collected, so that we can make sure that we have the right person. It's as much a protection for the accused as it is a remedy for the victim. I wanted to shift, though.
Yeah,
we were mentioning before that there could be other uses, and I wouldn't want people to think that I'm just puffing smoke here. I just did a quick survey on the internet, and I don't know if your camera can pick this up, but this is a picture of a I'm not sure how old the fetus would be.
It's an ultrasound picture.
It's an ultrasound. And it says at the top, is this child already a criminal? And the point of the words that follow are, well, we're doing our best to find out more about genetic causes of crime. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to solve the problem of crime yet because we don't have enough information about genetics. The implication is that if they did have the genetic information, they could do a sort of a witch hunt and prejudge before crimes occurred. In other words, crime prevention rather than finding out who did the crime that already occurred, and that is the concern.
But I have to underscore, though, nobody is talking about that in Canada. As a matter of fact, many critics say that our DNA databank it's far too stringent.
Well, if nobody intends to do it, then I would suggest that the government get serious about making a constitutional prohibition on the use of that information. And
well, you don't want to mention Constitution in Canada because,
right.
you know, you know, how many generations would pass away before we could get anything new written into the Constitution?
Ultimately, I think what we're looking at, as in any sort of security versus privacy issue, we're looking at a double-edged sword. And I'd just like to read one other thing for you. This was a wise man long since dead who said, "It has been said too that our governments, both federal and particular, want energy. That is, difficult to restrain both individuals and states from committing wrong. On the other hand, that energy which absolute governments derive from an armed force, which is the effect of the bayonet constantly held at the breast of every citizen, and which resembles very much the stillness of the grave, must be admitted also to have its inconveniences. We weigh the two together, and like best to submit to the former. Compare the wrongs committed with impunity by citizens among us with those committed by the sovereign in other countries, and the last will be found most numerous, most oppressive in the mind, and most degrading to the dignity of man." That was Thomas Jefferson, and he was basically saying that where something can be used either for security or to oppress the people, and it's in the government's hands, the best option is not to let the government have it.
Just assume that the government is going
We'll
to
abuse
oppress us. Okay, Paul McKeever, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's always nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Phone lines are jammed. We'll get to your calls when we come back. The number to call is 905-332-3131. We're back with more after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about Canada's DNA databank, just how far this kind of forensic tool should go and what restrictions should be placed on it. With her thoughts on all of this, we're joined by Priscilla Devilliers. She's the president of Caveat, which stands for Canadians Against Violence Everywhere, advocating its termination. Priscilla, thank you so much for joining us. So where do you stand on this issue?
Well, I look at this purely from a victim's point of view. And one of the real drives of somebody who's been desperately victimized is that this should never happen again. That every crime, that every violent crime after that is somehow a loss. Right. And that I personally, from my own experience, my daughter was killed by a multiple rapist, by a multiple killer. And the only way that he was stopped, he was out on bail, was by a fingerprint. Now, this could easily have been DNA, and if that had been the take in one of his earlier crimes, possibly he could have been stopped earlier.
So do you think that your daughter Nina would still be alive today if we had have had this DNA databank, this kind of technology up and running?
I mean, the case is difficult because the criminal justice failed in many cases, but let's look at Bernardo. We know that there was, after a huge inquiry and so on, there was DNA. He gave DNA. And by failing to address that DNA, so many more young women were victimized, and there were two frightful murders that will be on our conscience forever. So my approach to this is to look at it in an entirely pragmatic fashion. This is not a new tool. The United States has had it for many years. Britain has got it. Many countries have got it. It's a tool that is actually wonderful in that it's not invasive. It's extraordinarily accurate. It's something that puts the onus on the offender. In the case of Francis Roy, he was forced to explain to the court why his semen was found in the vagina of a child. And there's no other evidence that does that. He had to stand there and tell them. And the story that he gave was so preposterous that in fact one could then achieve what the end result. The other thing is, if we just look at the statistics, Eurostat has just come out with the new statistics on homicide in Canada. 60% of the homicides are committed by those who've already committed violent crimes. It's one of our stats. Now, is that not reason enough to take an extremely good look at those who have committed crimes, particularly violent crimes, and to say we have a right to at least use this information? And as for all the fanciful and theoretical purposes that it could be put to, we regulate so many other areas of privacy. We've got to work on that and absolutely work against it. But to risk lives and to risk quality of life, because we do not make full use of an extremely simple scientific tool, to me is a criminal act in itself.
Okay, our phones are so busy. So many people have strong opinions on this. Let's go to Roy on line 2. Go ahead, Roy. You're on the air.
Yeah.
Hi, Roy.
Hello. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, Roy. You're on the air.
I definitely agree with the lawyer who spoke before when he says if you don't want to get yourself DNA, don't commit a crime.
Right.
Because people complain about violence so much against other people, but when the government tries to do things about it, there are all these people come protesting about it.
Right.
You know, you don't want to be DNA, you don't want to be fingerprint. Try to keep away from trouble. Like the word DNA strike a lot of, so maybe that might keep them quiet for a bit. They know I will be protested if they was going to take it from you from the cradle when you don't do anything. You know, but once you commit a crime, I think you become, and you get arrested, you become the property of the state, so they do what they want with you.
Okay, Roy, thank you so much for your phone call. And really, when we're talking about collecting a DNA sample, as Scott Newark pointed out, all we're talking about is taking a little Q-tip like this and swabbing the inside of your mouth.
That's right.
I find that, in my opinion, it's far less invasive than giving fingerprints, or it's at least on the same level.
At least, and that's the point. Yeah, and you know all the other dangers, as I say, are things that can be controlled. And in this country, we control so many other aspects of privacy, and it can be built into the system.
Do you think, though, that the legislators really failed when they created Canada's DNA databank, in that they don't require DNA to be taken when a person is arrested? Take your fingerprints and take a DNA swab.
Absolutely, because of all the unsolved crimes that there are. And the problem is that the one thing that has a good prevention quotient is that the knowledge that there's a very high risk of charge and conviction. That is the one preventive tool we know has a chilling effect on people who will knowingly commit a crime. And if they know that there's a very high chance that they will be caught and convicted, that alone speaks to it. The other thing is that, you know, we are, and rightly so, we are very concerned about wrongfully convicting people. And quite frankly, it's in nobody's interests to convict the wrong person, particularly in violent crime. So that alone speaks to a very real need to eliminate somebody right at the beginning, and then they don't spend untold years in prison facing the justice system and facing all the horrors thereof, if in fact they're guilty, they're innocent.
Have we not learned our lessons from the case of Guy Paul Morin?
That's what I ask. I just find the whole thing absolutely extraordinary, and I might say that argument was very absent when this law was being discussed at Justice Committee. That I was amazed that there weren't more people there speaking out for this, because it would reduce the toll that's taken by wrongful conviction.
And not just, if we wanted to use, now of course the technology didn't exist when Guy Paul Morin was charged with the murder of Christine Jessup, but you know, if we've learned anything from the lessons of that case and how it was mishandled by the police, because the police thought that he was suspicious, the real murderer went free, because all of their efforts, all of their investigations were focused in his area. And after years and 2 trials later and a conviction and acquittal,
that's right.
After all of that, it turns out that he's been exonerated because of DNA evidence.
And there's somebody else walking around who poses a terrible threat to children. So from my point of view, from either side, our goal, I think, at least from a victim's point of view and from Caveat's point of view, is to find the best and most efficient and least onerous way of preventing this from happening again. And it would seem to me that this is a tool that we really cannot use in a sort of half-hearted fashion. And I might say we are, you know, are surrounded by very credible nations who use it on a daily basis as well. We're not the only people using it.
We've got time for one more phone call. Let's go to Danielle on line 7. Go ahead, Danielle, but you'll have to make it quick. We're running out of time.
Hi, I'd just like to make a quick comment on the fetus picture that was shown by the other person.
Yes, Paul McKeever.
And I just would like to remind everyone that genetics is only a part of things. genetics alone cannot determine the outcome of a person. A person is also subject to environmental, socioeconomics, and their upbringing.
Right.
So to determine that someone would be a criminal or could not be a criminal just solely by their genetics, I believe it's a little bit narrow-minded at this point.
You think that's too far-fetched, Danielle?
Well, I think so. And I also think that the database that is either being put or is already in place should be restricted to the sole use of criminal investigation, because people also do have rights even if they have been convicted of a criminal offense.
Okay, Danielle, I'm going to have to stop you there. And we should point out and really underscore this. That is how the DNA databank is being used right now.
Absolutely.
It is only for people who are convicted.
Absolutely, and with all the safeguards that Scott Newark spoke about, due and probable cause and so on, very, very strictly controlled. And this is controlled for fingerprints as well as for DNA. So I think that a lot of these fears are certainly areas that we should safeguard against. But at the moment, they are really just theoretical.
Okay, we have to take a commercial break, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live right after these messages. That brings us to the close of this edition of Rhonda London Live. Priscilla, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's always so nice talking to you.
Thank you, Rhonda.
Tomorrow on the show, teenagers account for a disproportionate number of traffic accidents, and many question whether 16 is really too young to drive. We'll hear some very different opinions on that, and as always, the phones will be open to hear your thoughts as well. That's tomorrow. I hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great day.
You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.